I'm Luann Good-Gingrich. I'm the director of the Global Labor Research Center at York University. The GLRC is really pleased to be hosting this event. First, I'll begin by acknowledging with gratitude the people who lived and worked in the place where York University is located, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Métis, and the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. We acknowledge that when European settlers first came to this land, they entered into a sacred treaty with the indigenous people here, the Two-Row Wampum, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. We acknowledge that this treaty and many others have been and continue to be violated by European and Canadian colonial practices that exploit and spoil the land, the water, the air, and all beings that live here. This meeting is virtual, and because of that, York's land acknowledgement may not represent the territory that you are currently on. I ask that you each take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and its current treaty holders. This is to remind ourselves that we are all treaty people and that whatever we do to the land and to others, we do to ourselves. We seek new ways of being in relationship with Indigenous peoples who are our hosts and with this land where we are guests. I want to say just a few words about the Global Labor Research Center at York University. We're an interdisciplinary scholarly community of researchers, students, and community partners. We engage in the study of work, employment, and labor in changing social, economic, political, and environmental contexts. We host research projects and visiting researchers. We work with unions and workers' organizations to both better understand the changing world of work and to support progressive social change. We also host a seminar series throughout the academic year, such as these kinds of events, where we bring together researchers and practitioners from across various sectors, disciplines, and regions. And we organize an annual graduate student symposium, usually held every fall in October. So I invite you to check out our website, drop us an email. We'd be glad to connect with you. And finally, I want to thank Nicole Cohen, a GLRC Advisory Committee member, and Greg DePuter for organizing this exciting and important discussion. And I also want to recognize the hard work of Hadra Mawali, the GLRC coordinator, for very capably looking after the promotion, registration, technical details, and more for this event. And I turn now the virtual floor to Greg.
Thank you, Luann, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm one of the co-organizers of this event, which is a collaboration between the Media Worker Union, CWA Canada, and a research group that I'm a part of, Cultural Workers Organize. There's no shortage of urgent reasons to talk today about labor organizing, but there are a couple specific prompts for holding this forum. We wanted to mark the release of the short video, Organizing Digital Media, that we screened to kick things off. Produced by the brilliant folks at Better Creative, the video celebrates the movement to unionize digital media and we hope offers some inspiration for the not yet organized. This panel is also a seriously belated launch for a book by Nicole Cohen and me called New Media Unions. Let's just say that there are better times to publish a book than the first weeks of a global pandemic. Guided by the insights of journalists who organize their newsroom, our book tells a story of the ongoing wave of labor organizing in digital media, which has seen more than 130 outlets and counting unionized since 2015. We look at why and how they organize and what they've gained by doing so. We thought the most fitting way to launch this video and book would be to gather protagonists from this movement, to share what they've learned about worker power and why organizing is so vital to the future of media and culture. We've assembled a group directly involved in organizing their workplaces and bargaining contracts. We wanted to take stock of this movement, to track its spread, to address some challenges, and also to shift the conversation from celebrating successful union drives to unpacking the difficult task of collective bargaining. And so by calling this event Collective Action Works, we're not only making a familiar claim, we also want to acknowledge the work of collective action. And so we're grateful and very fortunate to have Sarah Jaffe frame and moderate this conversation. By her own description, a labor journalist before it was cool, Jaffe is author, most recently, of the eloquent firebrand of a book, Work Won't Love You Back: How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted, and Alone. Thank you, Sarah, and all of our guests. Over to you.
Thank you. That's a lovely compliment. I'm really happy to be here with everyone. This is obviously a subject close to my heart as a formerly unionized journalist and now a member of the Freelance Solidarity Project, because I don't have a real job. It's a subject that I wrote about in my book to some degree or another, although I did not write directly about my own experience, because one of the places that we've really seen an uptick in unionization, and of course, we're talking today on the depressing day that the US unionization numbers for last year came out, and we're all sort of going, well, it's still going down. And to talk about one of the bright spots in the doom and gloom that has been the labor movement in the last decade is what I would like to be doing today. To see what we can learn from the experiences of everybody on this panel that can be useful not just to other media and culture workers, but maybe to workers in a lot of different fields that aren't yet unionizing, that haven't thought about it, or that are thinking about it, but don't really know yet how to put things into action. So I am, as Greg said, a labor journalist. I have been doing that more or less full-time since 2009. And back in 2009, it was not that easy to get editors to let me write labor stories. And though the trend numbers have still gone down in those recent years, what we have seen is increased activity in a lot of places and attention being drawn to the question of worker organizing in a variety of ways that I think it's a complicated picture. I certainly would not feel comfortable saying that everything is great now, but we are seeing an interest in thinking about issues of class and thinking about a politics of solidarity in the last decade or so that does give me a lot of hope. And particularly, I think one of the things that is worth talking about is the way that workers in fields that have maybe not been considered traditional homes for union organizing and often perhaps ignored by the existing labor movement are really leading the way in figuring out how to understand themselves as part of the working class and to understand their specific conditions as workers. So in my book, I write about this as this sort of labor of love ideology that really, it is a way that work is sort of compelled and motivated in the neoliberal age in particular, and sort of since deindustrialization, when the kinds of industrial jobs that nobody really expected you to like have become a smaller and smaller part of the workforce as a whole. And there are more jobs in culture, in media, but also in service and care work. The sort of exciting knowledge economy that we've heard about a lot through the 90s and the 2000s, we're living the realities of that right now. And everybody on this panel will agree with me that it is not all it was cracked up to be. It was certainly not all that it was promised when I was in school. And that, I spent quite a few years, and I'm sure our panelists have similar experiences of like dreaming of the day when I would get to be paid to write and how exciting that was going to be and how great it would be. And then I found out making more money waiting tables. My schedule was worse waiting tables, but like a lot of the other issues that I had in that situation, the same sort of expectations of performing happiness and keeping customers happy and keeping everybody else happy and sort of grinding myself down into dust were just as prevalent in media as they had been in the service industry. And so, this is where, in some ways, where my book came from, was this understanding that like these things are not as different as we have been told they are. Our working conditions are often, we're all fighting against things like overwork, unpaid overtime, what they call crunch in the video games industry, what we in journalism just call never being able to clock off because this thing is always going off in your pocket. We're dealing with sexual harassment. We're dealing with race and gender pay gaps that continue to exist. We're dealing with racism on the job. We are dealing with being pigeonholed into certain types of work based on what we look like and how we talk. We're dealing with the perception on top of all that we should be grateful to have these jobs because they're cool jobs. And I think I'm going to wrap this up in just a second, but I don't think it's an accident that we're seeing upticks in the fields of media and culture right now, unionizing, because it is becoming clearer and clearer that all of these dream jobs that we supposedly have are just not actually that good, and that they could be better. And I think that one of the things that has actually made the unionization of media and culture workers powerful is that we do care about the work that we do. And that gives us a stronger impetus to stay in the job and make it better, rather than just quitting and finding something else. So on that note, I am going to have some questions for our lovely panelists, who I'll just introduce in a second. We will be taking audience questions a little bit later. You can go ahead and put those in the Q&A box down below whenever you have them. I will be keeping an eye on how many we have coming in, so don't feel like you have to wait for us to start saying, we'd like audience questions now. And I'll try to give a couple of reminders of that while we're talking. And my lovely panelists are Kaitlyn Chandler, who worked at the Brooklyn Academy of Music for 5 years and helped to organize BAM's administrative and creative workers. She currently works at Droga 5. Marina Fang is a national reporter at HuffPost. She serves on her union committee and is a proud member of the Writers Guild of America East. Arshy Mann, who I think we have gotten now, we were waiting for, is the host and co-producer of the podcast Commons. He was part of Canadaland's recent union drive and served on the union's bargaining committee. Naib Mian works on interactives and multimedia at The New Yorker magazine, where he is also unit chair of the union and served on the bargaining committee. And last but very much not least, Scott Morales is a strategy and transformation coordinator for Oxford University Press. And he is the unit chair of the OUP USA Guild and is on the bargaining committee. And with that, so I have several questions that I am going to ask of the panel. Some of it I will ask specific people to respond to. Other things you all can jump in. And here we go. So I want to start because the description for this event was written at a time when we thought the pandemic was beginning to recede. And here we are in yet another wave of COVID. And I am drinking tea because I am getting over COVID myself. So I want to start with asking about organizing during a pandemic. The New Yorker's contract fight took place during lockdown. Oxford University Press organized during the pandemic. So I would love to ask both of you to sort of talk about what it was that you learned about organizing in a moment where we had to do everything virtually. What it meant to organize a big public contract campaign when we had to do everything virtually. And for the rest of you as well, I will throw it to you to have any thoughts that you have about keeping a union vibrant when, again, we're doing everything over Zoom and we're all zoomed out. So Scott, do you want to start?
Absolutely. And I hope you're feeling better, Sarah. Got that tea. It's a really great question. I joined the effort to organize at OUP in November of 2019. So I was just sort of starting to get my sea legs around organizing as a principal in person, asking people out for coffees, talking to them in the hallways, sort of planting seeds here and there, trying to create those relationships that then take outside work to then start approaching, talking about the U word. So I was starting to learn all of that right when, everything changed. So in a way, for me, it was certainly don't want to use the term beneficial when talking about a global pandemic, but it was certainly a way to. I wasn't that entrenched in the more traditional organizing principles that had been sort of established up until that point. I was a part of the conversation with the organizing committee of how do we adjust to this? How do we transition to this? And in some ways, it was obviously much more difficult, right? Like it was much more difficult to create those relationships first to then, move on to the conversations about unionizing. But I will say that in some ways, it was actually, it worked out well for us. It provided us a lot more opportunities. I think that for some of us, there's always this difficulty, and not just with organizing, just in life, with transitions, right? Like how do you make that transition from talking to someone about their work and about their day and about what's going on with them and start to slowly plant the seeds and then transition to talking about organizing? And I feel like we still did that a little bit, but I think that there was a lot more directness when we would call up people to try to have outreach with them. We got to the point, I think, a lot quicker. We still did our homework and made sure that we were talking to a relatively friendly person, but a receptive person, that is, but we still got to the point kind of, I think, in a much more efficient way. I also think, in addition to that, which I'm sure is something that we brought up quite a bit, especially around this particular topic, I think the pandemic, as we've seen, has really crystallized the place of work in all of our lives. I think that we have just, as a culture, seen that that our work should not be something that defines us, and the fact that a lot of us now working from home, that we're surrounded by our families more often. The need to try to drive a delineating a border between our work and our personal lives, I think, has really helped to make the need for favorable working conditions much more prevalent in people's minds. I don't think it's a coincidence that after quite a while of trying to organize at OUP, that we finally were able to make this happen this year. I don't think that it's a coincidence that you're seeing all of this movement right now with unionizing within all of these fields, during a pandemic. I think it has really made people reassess what is important to them and what they're willing to put up with at work. And it's provided a wealth of agitational material. I mean, the response from OUP regarding the pandemic, and then and having that shed a light on all of the other things that we saw that they were not doing right, or things that we thought could change, really helped to propel us to have these conversations with people who are already sort of reassessing what their lives were like anyway. So I think that, I think that the organizing in a pandemic was certainly challenging, but in a lot of ways, there were times when I was like, I don't know, are we really going to be able to push over this hump? But we were able to push over this hump, I think, because of the fact that people just had a much clearer idea of what they wanted from their workplace.
Yeah, excellent. Naib, do you want to?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't think that it's possible to answer this question without addressing the fact that the pandemic really was like a huge radicalizing moment for so many people. And I think, people were stuck at home with no space, like they couldn't afford more space, they couldn't afford childcare, they couldn't afford like basic needs. And it became really apparent that both their workplaces and even our government didn't really care about their health or safety. I mean, I joined our unit council, our bargaining committee, during the pandemic once we were already remote. And of course, it was challenging to bargain, to organize, to meet with people remotely. But at the same time, I think so many people, we're now thinking about these issues a lot more. And that really added to the organizing effort. Beyond that, the pandemic has also has provided its own sort of topics for discussion and bargaining and in organizing. I mean, even once we won our contract, negotiating with the company over return to office and things like that has been a huge organizing push. we've pushed the company to push back the return to office several times because they weren't providing enough information about safety precautions, and negotiated into our contract protection so that workers didn't have to go into the workplace if they feared for their health or safety. So in that way, I think the pandemic, while a challenge, was really also a huge organizing push as well.
Did anybody else want to offer some thoughts about pandemic organizing?
Maybe I can jump in. Is this working?
Yes. You are here. Hello.
Great. Yeah, I'm Arshy. I work at Canadaland, which is a small podcast studio based out of Toronto, Canada. But it's, we kind of punch above our weight, I'd like to think. And our organizing drive basically was started right before the pandemic, but every other part of what we did at Canadaland, at the Canadaland Union, was happening while the pandemic was going on and while we were basically all locked down. Because here in Toronto especially, we were not allowed to see anybody for months on end. Oh, this looks very strange. And I think, like previous panelists have been saying, the pandemic certainly made everyone's priorities clearer, made it so that people were more interested, and there was more urgency to actually securing some of the gains that we'd already had and to push further. But on some of the things, safety certainly became a much more urgent issue, which it really isn't oftentimes for office workers, for white collar workers. Outside of areas like sexual harassment, safety doesn't come up too often. And for us, we had immunocompromised people on staff. There was a push to try to get us back into the office probably too early. And by having been organized, we were able to, I think, effectively push back against that. And so that was very helpful. I will say that the toughest part about trying to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement during lockdown is we couldn't sit at a bargaining table. It all had to be done through Zoom. And bargaining on Zoom is a special kind of hell. It was horrifying. It was soul draining. And I think, bargaining is already a process that is kind of emotionally exhausting and a little bit fraught. And yet, when you're doing it over Zoom, you don't even it takes away just that one other extra element of humanity, right? And that just made things really tough. But after a long while, I am happy to say that as of this week, I think we just announced it maybe 10 minutes ago, we've ratified our first collective bargaining agreement. So, it can be done during a pandemic, but oh boy, it wasn't fun.
Yeah, okay, well, I'm going to return to the questions of the first contract process in a bit, but I wanted to get our other panelists who I haven't gotten to speak yet first. So I want to toss this one to you all. One of the things that media and culture workplaces have in common is, of course, the labor of love that I was talking about before, and this idea that we should be grateful to work in these really cool jobs and therefore not make any demands or even polite requests for ourselves. And that is something that you often have to confront in organizing when a lot of people are still sort of enjoying that Kool-Aid, and you have to sort of shake some people out of it. So I wonder if, and I'll start with Kaitlyn on this one, if you have any experiences of sort of working through that yourself or with your coworkers during your organizing process.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks Nicole and Greg and everybody for also inviting me. Yeah, this definitely happened at BAM. BAM is a very cool place in Brooklyn. Whenever I told people that I worked at BAM, they're like, oh, wow, it's so cool. And I'd be like, yeah, it's cool. And then I'm trying to think about, I was thinking about the title of your book about work won't love you back, but at the same time, there is some type of intangible love that you get from working at a place that feels very special. And working with really amazing coworkers that you work with, who are very talented And, I was paid to see art sometimes 2, 3, 4 times a week. And even if I didn't like it. And yeah, it's like, you want it to work there. You want it to be real, that dream of like, after you graduate or wherever you've come from, you get this cool job and you like want it to be like, yeah, I get paid to edit videos and move pixels every day. And that's what, and you want it to be, you want that to feel like it's actually, like it can actually work, like the money and everything makes sense, but it just doesn't. And like, I mean, the New Yorker, I think, has said, I think the New Yorker has said a lot of I remember the New Museum Union also said it a lot. You can't eat prestige. You can't make something make sense that doesn't make sense. And it's kind of painful to not be able to make it make sense, to not have everything align when you have such a cool place, a cool workplace, and you do something very special. So yeah.
Marina, you have
Yeah, I mean, what Kaitlyn said really resonated with me too. I work at HuffPost. It's a progressive news organization. I've been there for 7 years, in part because I really like working at HuffPost, and I've gotten to do a lot of really cool work reporting. And, journalism is a really competitive industry to get into. And so are so many arts and culture jobs. And we are told, like, you should be grateful to have a job. And we're told that constantly. And at a certain point, you kind of internalize that, and you just sort of feel like, at your worst moments, you just remind yourself, oh, but like, this is a cool job. And it's not enough. You also need to have equitable working conditions. You have to, all of these things that we've unionized for, those are really important beyond the job and beyond the work that we do. I think also creative industries, there's that idea of like, your work needs to be your identity. And often that can, that's the thing that fuels us, but it also leads to having basically no work-life balance. And having a union has been really important in creating those boundaries between work and non-work. I will say, on a very personal note, like, I'm an Asian woman, my parents are immigrants. I was very conditioned to just, not always speak up, just work hard, do the work, and the work will drive everything else. And if you do good work, like that's ultimately the goal in life. And the work will only get you to a certain point. And it took me a long time to really recognize that even if the job I'm doing is great, even if the work I'm doing is really meaningful, I still need to speak up for things that are not equitable and things that are affecting me and other people in the workplace. And unionizing has been really instrumental in helping me, just as a person, recognize that it's not okay to just internalize problems that are happening. And I think that's true of so many people that I know on our union committee and across the industry. People are really recognizing that you can't just do the work and be proud of the work. There's so much more that needs to happen across the industry.
Yeah, anybody else got some thoughts on this subject before we move on? Naib, yeah?
Yeah, Kaitlyn took my punchline there with "you can't eat prestige." That was my favorite strike slogan that we had. But just today I was like talking to coworkers about people being asked to take on more responsibilities, like cooler, fun responsibilities, without any extra pay, without any like title changes or anything. doing the work of like multiple employees for the same pay. And like, this is a huge problem in this type of industry where you're asked to be grateful, you're asked to not ask for anything because you're doing what you love. And I think the impact that I see is like doubly negative, because on the one hand, you get the fact that there's people now who, again, like can't even afford to live in the city, or, you know, during our contract fight, I came across employees who had been working here for over 20 years, making like still $40,000, which is just cruel. But at the same time, then you get folks who inevitably leave for better pay, for better conditions, and you're left with media and culture being saturated with you know, folks who are independently wealthy who can afford to be in this space, and those people are, again, primarily wealthy, primarily white. And so it becomes like a diversity issue as well. So I think it's so important to address that culture in this industry for, you know, all of those reasons.
Also, just one thing has kind of resonated with me about this is that I go back to one of a common anti-union talking point, and something that was anecdotally used against us when we were organizing, that a unionization drive is often driven by a few dissatisfied actors that are just, you know, it's just a few people who are just pissed off about their jobs and don't really want to be there. And they're the ones that are sort of spoiling it for everyone. But I think the one common thread that I found, certainly at OUP and all of the other events that I've gone to like this, and in what a lot of people are saying, the other panelists are saying here, is that far more often than not, what you have are people that actually really love their work, and you know, that they want to work at their job. They don't want to have to go somewhere else. They want to make the place that they're working at better. And that is, I think, it's just so fascinating that anti-union talking point still kind of sticks around. That you know, oh well, it's just some people they'll never be satisfied. Well, no, it's not that. It's people that actually really love their job, and that's why they want to be able to keep them, and you know, and have a living wage while they have it, and have, you know, transparency, and have better benefits, and have all the other things that a union can fight for.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a few places I want to go immediately from that, but I think I'm going to go back to this question of the first contract, because I think we get a lot of attention on the initial union drive and winning recognition. And then there's often less attention paid to contract campaigns, which can be a lot longer and messier and more drawn out. And, you know, a lot of media companies in particular get the initial good press of saying, oh, we'll voluntarily recognize the union. And then it takes 3 years to get a contract, and they fight you on every little thing. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what you have been able to win in those first contracts, and sort of the struggles of going through them, because they are unfun and unpleasant in a lot of ways, right? Especially because, again, if you do actually care about the workplace and want to make it better, it can be really disheartening to watch your boss fight you on everything. So I'm not going to throw to Naib first on this one, because I know the most about the New Yorker campaign. But so I don't know, anybody else want to jump in? Kaitlyn, great. Yeah.
I just want to disagree with Arshy. Arshy, like, I don't know what you mean, 8 hours on a Zoom call on a Saturday when you're bargaining a contract. That is like the funnest thing. I love that. I would love to do that every weekend. No, it's just literal. It's like beneath hell. It's terrible. To negotiate a contract via Zoom. And we started our contract negotiation 6 months before the pandemic. Little did we know we have 6 months more to go. And that's when we conveniently were hitting all of the wallet hitting topics. It was just extremely fraught. And it was like, even before we got up to our vote, we had another union, or a couple of other unions, who went to the AFL-CIO to give us an Article 20. It's a very convoluted thing that I'm not going to go into, but it delayed our voting process, and then further delayed, obviously, our first contract, and basically bargaining our first contract. It's there's just not enough that can be kind of demystified about the bargaining contract for, I think, that could to be easily distilled in, like, I guess, media, in like an Instagram post, because everything is so nuanced, because you don't want to show your hand, because you don't, there's so much at stake. Like there was, you know, right in the middle of our, you know, our contract negotiation, the pandemic hit, and then basically any leverage we had was kind of like, it just dissipated, because there was bigger problems, bigger fish to fry. There was life and death issues happening, and so what were we going to do? Like say no, pay attention to our contract, to these clauses, trying to get press was just extremely hard. So I don't know, it was extremely hard in the middle of the pandemic. And I'd love to hear what other people say about how their process went, because gaining steam was just terrible.
Yeah, anybody? Arshy, yeah?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in. Yeah, gaining steam was hard. We found that our the tactics that were available to us were limited. So, you know, even just small things that I think a union would normally do in a drive, like wearing, you know, union clothing in the office, all of a sudden, or taking a lunch break all together to kind of, you know, demonstrate that we are organized and that everyone's kind of in it together. It's harder to do over Zoom. And so it was hard as well, I think, to also build up people's confidence in the process. All of the you know, unit members, like we were so just broken by both the pandemic and then reporting on the pandemic, that and then lockdowns, and so we were just getting it from all sides, and then having to go through the, you know, really exhausting work of bargaining was just made that all the more difficult. You know, another thing that we struggled with, and this would have been a problem even if there wasn't a pandemic, is just we were walking a very fine line in how we could bargain, because, you know, one of every union's kind of biggest, you know, most important tactics is the ability to go public, to talk about your grievances. However, at the same time, we're a patron financed organization. Half of our funding actually comes from the people that, you know, comes from our listeners. The other half comes from advertising, but, you know, that's a huge amount of money. And like a lot of smaller media organizations, you know, there isn't that much money there. We are profitable, but like not by that much. And so there was a real worry that if we get too aggressive in public, people are going to pull their support for the organization, which is not necessarily what we want. We want solidarity from folks, but we don't want them to stop giving us money, because, like, while yes, that is you know, a good form of protest, you know, we need that money for the stuff that we wanted. So that was an additional difficulty. But I think that actually would have been a problem regardless of the pandemic for us, but kind of shows just how in these new media models as well that are emerging, and that are places where a lot of this organizing is going to start taking place, that things can get complicated pretty quickly, and there isn't really a playbook, I think, for a lot of especially smaller digital media organizations in how they want to approach organizing.
Yeah, the question of patrons, and also just the thing that you mentioned about like organizing and struggling in your own working conditions during a pandemic while covering other people's working conditions in a pandemic was like an extra weight that I think, yeah, I know I'm probably not the only one who felt it. Does anyone else want to jump in on this question before I move on?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the New Yorker's contract. I mean, I joined the New Yorker and our union right after we went public. And so I wasn't there for sort of that like initial buzz around going public. And well, I mean, exactly what you described happened. You know, the process was dragged on for 3 years, and it was long and it was tough. But I think that itself also helped to really like radicalize and organize people as well. I mean, before the pandemic, I remember we were in the office. We thought we would have our contract by 2020, we had these contract 2020 signs all over the office. And I mean, even back then, people felt a little nervous about like putting signs on their desks. And by the time it like the bargaining continued into 2021, I mean, people were ready to, we did salary transparency actions. People were ready to picket our festival. And even by the end, we had a 97% strike authorization vote. And so like over that time, despite the fact that it was long and it was tough and things might go quiet during the contract fight, I think we really like continued to escalate throughout that process and continue to organize. And I think, like had to get creative a little bit with how to generate buzz, whether that was like picketing outside of Anna Wintour's home or creating our own version of the New Yorker or strike issue. But yeah, I think people got really, really motivated and really organized on their own to get us over to the end.
I personally really loved the picket at Anna Wintour's home, and I was really mad that I wasn't in New York when it happened, because I would have been there. So one of the things that several of y'all have touched on in different ways is the questions of equity in the industry and race and gender discrimination, and the fact that if journalism doesn't pay well, then it ends up being done exclusively by rich people who are often white rich people. So yeah, I wanted to sort of turn to that a little bit more explicitly and talk about like some of these issues that came up in many of your union drives in terms of figuring out how to make demands that were winnable about getting real equity in the workplace, especially in again, prestigious workplaces that then become, everybody who works there looks the same. So I don't know. Am I just going to pick somebody? I mean, Marina, you spoke about this a little bit already. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that it's hard. It's really, really hard. So we're on our second contract at HuffPost. Actually, it's so weird to think about this, but kind of going back to previous questions about the pandemic, we bargained our second contract almost exactly 2 years ago. So it was like one of the last big things I did prior to the pandemic. And it's so strange to think about now, like being in conference rooms and, gathering with people right before the pandemic. And actually just today I had a meeting we just had our like regular committee meeting, and we were talking about how we're less than a year out. So our contract is 3 years. So we're now less than a year out from bargaining again for our third contract. So the work never ends. But yeah, one of our big goals in our second contract was, of course, to build on our first contract. And one of the key areas was on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that's just something that had come up again and again. And it's hard. It's really hard to get to kind of figure out how to best like what your priorities are. And also because so many of, I'm proud of the things that we won in our contract, but so many of them were really like the bare minimum, like getting $35,000 in funds for our diversity committee, which I'm on, and then to use that money toward various types of diversity initiatives, which is great, but that's just one tiny thing in the vast array of things that need to happen in newsrooms. We got what's called a Rooney Rule. So anytime there's a position listed, our management or whoever the hiring manager is needs to consider at least one person from an underrepresented group, which we delineated in the contract. One big win that we did get was management wanted to put white women as a marginalized group, which they are not, particularly in our newsroom, which is actually pretty good in terms of gender parity. But still, one candidate. which, that's the bare minimum. And hiring in general is just the bare minimum that news organizations and frankly, all organizations that struggle with diversity issues need to be doing, because once you hire someone, are they being hired into an inclusive environment? Are they getting to be doing the work that they really want to do? Or are they being tokenized or being pigeonholed into covering a certain beat or a certain area because of their background? One thing that we're currently engaged in in our union is actually something we tried to win in our contract and did not, but is what we're using our $35,000 in diversity committee funding. We're trying to do a climate assessment of our newsroom, because, like I said, when you hire people from underrepresented backgrounds, you need to make sure that you're bringing them into an inclusive environment. And in order to do that, you really need to assess on all levels what is happening in your newsroom. So there's just a whole host of issues that, like, a contract can be really important in doing. And also just in general, when you're fighting on these issues, you have to be looking at it from all of these different angles, because often, especially leadership will say, we're going to focus our energies on hiring, or we're going to focus our energy on training or mentoring. All of those things are important, but you have to be doing all of them in a really concrete way.
Yeah. I think the retention question is such an important one, right? Because it'll be like, oh, people, and they just weren't a good fit. And it's like, why is that? Anyone else feeling a burning need to? Yeah, go ahead. Arshy, yeah. What was it? Did you?
Yeah, sure. I can speak to that. I think retention is exactly where we saw most of the problems when it comes to diversity, at least at our company, and where, in media, I've also seen issues. There's a lot of really smart, young, non-white folks, people from other underrepresented communities who start off in the media and are occasionally given opportunities, although I think at a lower rate than typically white men. But I see that the burnout rates are just so incredibly high, because not only in addition to just the tough industry that journalism and media has become, you have to deal with a lot of just extra bullshit all the time. And that is particularly exhausting. So when it came to actually trying to get, during our bargaining process, trying to figure out how to do that, we focused how to actually make a more conducive environment for people. We really focused on those training aspects and making sure that just the basics are in place, because especially at a smaller kind of founder-led company, everything's run by the seat of their pants, and that leads to, you think, even more burnout. So making sure that we do have a proper grievance process in place, making sure that there's restrictions around overtime, and that if you do overtime, you're getting paid for it. That's costly to the employer to actually, try to run you into the ground. We still don't know how that's all going to work out, and hopefully it's going to make a difference. But yeah, I think that retention aspect is one of the more difficult parts of everything, because I've seen so many people, I've seen companies pat themselves on the back so often for diverse hiring. And then within 6 months, people quit, people are pushed out. Yes, the entire, oh, you weren't a great fit, like, seen it so many times. And I think that's a critical fight that needs to continue.
Yeah, I wanted to talk more about the retention too. Something that you see often in journalism and arts and culture, because they're such competitive industries, leadership will say, oh, that person left because they got a better opportunity. Which, yes, that's true, but you need to, if you're a manager, if you're someone in leadership, you need to think about why that is. They're leaving because of something that your newsroom is not providing. And we've seen this like again and again, anytime there's an exodus of people of color at any news organization, newsroom leaders have to take a really hard look at what is happening. And it's often because people of color are not getting paid equally, for example, or are not getting the opportunities that maybe their white colleagues are maybe just being pigeonholed to only cover certain issues, or, just dealing with a lot of bullshit at work every day. And that sort of dismissal of what deeper problems there might be is just pervasive. I see it again and again. Anytime a newsroom or a news organization is in the news for seeing this exodus of people of color. I mean, right now, NPR, there's been a lot of news about how there's been a lot of prominent people of color hosting some of their really big shows. They've left recently, and this happens again and again. This has happened at HuffPost for the last couple of years, and that's actually part of why we're doing this climate assessment, because we want to have a very clear and like documented process of understanding why this is. We know it's a problem, we all see it, but it's harder to dismiss it when it's a documented pattern. It's easy to dismiss it when it's an anecdote. And often leadership will say, oh, this is one person leaving because they got a better opportunity. No, it's 20 people leaving or 30 people leaving, and here's why. And often the problems are very similar, and it's important to, have that in a place where we can point to that and say, look, this is a pattern.
Yeah.
Also love to say something on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, this also, I mean, we all know, like what you were saying, Marina, like we all see it. BAM was also going through an anti-oppression process. I think slightly motivated due to the city and cultural funding. At the same time, it was going through when we were organizing and then starting our campaign, and it was it was extremely fraught process. Just to let you know, like it was extremely combining the two. It was both a catalyst and also it made everything a little bit more intense, because all of these emotions were on the surface of our colleagues and everything was just so palpable. But and that included many courses, discussions, listening sessions that everybody had to kind of go through, that we hoped everybody had to go through. It obviously like changed and in different areas of BAM, from the board down to like the stagehands, like how that reaction happened. But like you said, we also went through the same thing of like trying to fight to get words into a contract that just said what said the values that the institution said it had. Like if you really believe those, if you really want to live them, can we have those in the contract? And we just kept bumping up against this wall, and we eventually we had to do all of these like testimonies at negotiating table, which we did in person before COVID, and I think it was extremely effective. Like eventually they budged. But it's just crazy that you can be like at the same table with these people that you work with and that you see every day, and then just be living two completely different experiences. And throughout the DEI process, there was an amazing DEI liaisons who BAM made, BAM kind of like not made, but like who like were normal employees who like came up through the ranks and were like, we're gonna help spearhead this work. And then we would work with them a lot of times and just talk about like, what does BAM need? Like what can we do? What can even, because it would go, there was, like you said, like you have to see it from so many different angles. There's all these lines crossing that everybody needs to kind of be accountable for. And so like they would say, well, our parent union, UAW 2110, they would say, okay, well, you need to have them also be going through these lessons, also be doing this. And we're like, of course, like they were definitely on board. But you know, eventually, like, we kept realizing that while we were pushing against the DEI and liaisons, we're also pushing up against, and, you know, at the end of the day, like, we needed to team up together in order to really effectively make all of our realities, like, and all of our working lives a little bit better, a little bit more dignified. And it was extremely fraught. We ended up, after BAM laid off a lot of people, including ushers. It was like over 700 at the beginning of the pandemic. So we ended up making a mutual aid fund with the DEI liaisons, and, you know, raising a lot of money. Like you said, Arshy, I think, like, do the people who are the audience members out there, do they give money to the institution, or do they try to give it to the strike fund? Like, I think, like, they're at the end of the day, like, board members were also donating to our DI mutual aid because there was such a need there, especially with COVID. So yeah, I don't know. It's extremely fraught. That's all I have to say.
Just a brief note from our perspective, I think one of the things that strikes me about this conversation about prestige is that we're all talking about a bunch of prestigious organizations and organizations that thrive off of and constantly want to flaunt how prestigious they are, how exceptional they are. You know, in our case, that's constantly mentioned the reach of OUP. We're a global company with this huge global audience, and then just, you know, you know, and then to look at the kind of the representation that you have on the staff and how non-global it looks, you know. And so it's been, you know, I think that as is probably the case with lots of other places at OUP, we have several instances of these, you know, committees or little, you know, that are consultative and barely that, that have no real power to push any amount of change that came up. And D&I was certainly one of them here. And I think that, you know, it's a little bit different situation that we're in because we're sort of at the starry-eyed dreamer part where we haven't signed our first contract yet, you know, so we're still building our first contract. We haven't started bargaining yet. So there's all these initiatives that we are trying to dream up of and think about. And one of the things that we keep coming back to is that it's not enough to push diversity, inclusion, underrepresented folks at the entry level. We want to have it at all levels throughout. You know, we want middle managers, we want executives, we want more diverse authorship. We want our work to look like what our globe looks like, and to, you know, one of the things that I think really crystallized unionizing for a lot of the people whom with this, you know, this is such a paramount issue with, is that we're never going to get there without some sort of radical change of the status quo. Like, we're never going to get where we want to get if we just leave it up to managers doing what they've been doing. We need something else to be able to push this to get to where we need to get in order to be the exceptional, prestigious place that we claim to be.
That's such a good point. I also really love the pushing for more diverse, prestigious authors. And I know that, you know, some of the media outlets that have unionized have also put this in terms of, you know, putting pressure on company to do better by the freelancers, which as a freelancer, we greatly appreciate. So we've got a bunch of audience questions coming in right now, and I am going to take some moderator's privilege and combine a few of them because some of them are very similar. And I think we were sort of just in some way answering one of them, which was a question about whether the organizations that the panel represents outliers in the industry. And maybe by having unions, although that is changing quickly, but I think what we've learned from listening to all of you in relatively different organizations is that the problems are all the damn same, aren't they? So in terms of outlier, I think that's a bit depressing, but true. So we have a couple of questions about overcoming the fear factor in the workplace, in organizing, people who don't want to sort of stick their neck out, or places where there's a real culture of fear. Somebody was talking about a super toxic workplace culture that's really hard to shake. So yeah, does anybody want to talk about how you guys fought through the sort of fear factor, again, your own or dealing with, you know, helping your colleagues through it?
think one of the things that helped us, it wasn't so much fear for us, although there was a little bit of that. It was more of an apathy or like, well, there's nothing we can do about it. Like, this is just the way it is, you know? And so I think that one of the things that really helped with our effort was as much collective action as possible, as many different kinds of events as possible, getting people in front of their colleagues, getting them to a chance to talk with other people, to communicate with other people, to see that the problems that we face at work aren't exclusive to us. I mean, they take on our own, you know, depending on our own situations, there's a little bit different facets to it. But generally speaking, we all are kind of facing the same issues, and finding that common bond between all of us, and finding that solidarity that comes with standing together, I think that it builds upon itself. You know, the more that we had our events, the more that people showed up to them, the more and more it emboldened people to take a stand. One of the single best things that we did when we got closer and closer to our election were testimonials. That just, you know, simple. It wasn't that hard. It wasn't even that revolutionary of an idea, but it was so effective. Going on to Instagram and Twitter and seeing your colleagues stand up there with a pro-union sign and talking about why they wanted to unionize, why they felt like they needed this, what are the things that they wanted to accomplish via a union. And the response that we got to that from people within the unit and people outside the unit, even people from some sympathetic managers, I mean, it was just a really stunning response. And you know, it really helped galvanize people to realize that this is nothing to be afraid of. And in fact, this is an opportunity to finally affect change at our work, instead of having to just deal with it or just look for another job or just live with just the threat of, you know, as someone else said on the panel, like, well, you know, what are you going to do? Are you going to leave? Like, fine, go somewhere else. No, it doesn't have to be like that. This is a chance for us all to do something together. And so, yeah, I think that what really, really helped us was realizing that we're not alone. And that's the beautiful thing about unionizing, right? Is that we aren't alone. We are all in this together. And with strength, with those numbers comes strength.
Yeah. Anybody have anything to add, or?
Yeah. I'm not gonna lie, I was like so well liked before I started organizing, which is like, I'm not gonna like wax poetic, because like, you know, unionizing is radical, unionizing is revolutionary, and you are doing something that is going to radically shift the power in your workplace towards you against, you know, where it was before, a unilateral system of like, this is the way it is. Like Scott was saying, like, it was like, it's you just live with it. You live with this like apathy of like not being able to change anything. You felt it was futile. You just tried to find little wins in your workday. Like when I started at BAM, like there wasn't even free coffee. Like that was like literally one of my first jumping off points. Like I had free coffee when I worked for Walmart. Like I just thought, like, come on, can we get something? Like, can we, I don't know. And you know, and I realized after a while, like it was like live with it or change it or leave, I guess. But at the same time, like wherever you go, there's going to be problems. Every workplace has problems. And you know, unions, they're just one tool. I just saw it as one tool. If you just look at, obviously there's all the graphs of when unionizing was hot and then industrialized and militant, and then the wages going down. We have all these graphs, but you know, at the end of the day, you get some very basic benefits that you just do not have as an at-will employee. And now that I think those at least were extremely helpful in being able to convince other people, like, this is why I'm doing it. You know, Weingarten writes, like, I want somebody else in a meeting with me who is at the same level as me to see how my manager's treating me, how they're talking to me. You know, basic things of like, oh, I can't be fired unless you have cause, you know. They have to go through, there's a barrier between the company and you that's there to protect you. And without it, you were just, I mean, I just realized like how out in the cold I was. and how like anxiety ridden I was. So yeah, I mean, it was just like these basic benefits, and there was a huge fear. There was a huge fear even when I was doing it, like just walking up to BAM every day, and it's this huge, imposing building from the 1800s, and thinking like, oh, I'm gonna try to change this place. Like, come on. Like I'm sure you guys have felt the same thing, but like, it's just like, like Scott said, like you were doing it together. Like you are the people that actually make that place run. Without you, there is no culture. There is no whatever you're selling, whether it's newspaper, performances, media, whatever it is. Like the workers make that thing. And obviously you're not being, it's not even close to like equitable to me. The amount of work that people were doing to make the shows happen at BAM versus what they were getting paid, like 20, 30 years, and it's just not even close to like, profitable, or not profitable, but just like livable or dignified in New York City. So, I mean, that's what really energized me, because I wanted to do something that would help all of my colleagues. And I knew, and I saw it, and I just said, like, this will help. This will help. This is something. And, doing it with like really amazing, kind and smart people, having a really strong organizing committee. I saw that. And it was, and like, we didn't do as many events, and it still is sometimes a little like, I mean, I'm not there anymore. But when I left after we ratified our first contract, it still felt a little fraught, to see like a union button, to see somebody with like a union in the background of their Zoom. It's still a contentious thing, but it's not it's not like a switch. It's going to take time. It takes time to seep into the culture. We were really energized by MoMA's campaign, and like when they were unionized in like the 70s, and then they went on strike in like 2000. And, it's so embedded in their culture now that, the board is even, I feel like the board is even proud of like that they have a unionized workforce, and like strikes are like seen as like somewhat like spectacles, but that's another topic. Anyway, I'll let somebody else go.
Yeah. Naib, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the difficult things or challenges that we faced was the fact that like so much of people's work and their success really depended on like intimate personal relationships with like managers or people that they were working with, and they didn't want to rock the boat. And like some people, I mean, some departments, some managers honestly like were toxic, and they were really afraid of retaliation and things like that. But I think so many departments are so siloed that people don't even see what their coworkers are going through. And so in a lot of ways, I think exposing that, first of all, was like really effective for people to understand that like, even if my situation is okay, like my friend over here is going through some like shit. But also at the same time, I mean, we weren't really asking people to stick their necks out on their own. Like the whole point was that like we were all in this together, and that, like the title of this event, Collective Action Works, like as long as we're doing it together, like there's safety in numbers, and that like, what are they going to do? Like fire all of us? But I mean, even on like the individual level, I mean, with my organizing, with my involvement in the union, I always turn back to words that one of my colleagues shared with me when I was like pretty new in the union, which is that, like despite all the fear of what managers or whatever will think of you, like the future of this industry is like your colleagues around you, and they're going to remember and respect the work that you did for them. And I think like that's really important for me, and like driving me forward, is that, like we're all here together, we're all in this together, and like we're not going to forget these fights that we did.
Yeah.
Maybe, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I was just going to jump in with one tangible thing that I think helped us in terms of getting over that fear factor. And this is kind of where all of the union drive even started, is just somebody created a Slack group just for us to complain. That was not part of like the workplace Slack, in which we just had our private emails, just so we could vent. And we got, again, we're a pretty small organization, around 12, 13 people. We got all the non-managers in there, and just by complaining, within a few months, we're basically all organized now, and we know what each other's problems are, and like a lot of the hard work's done. Obviously, that's not replicable at every institution, especially larger workplaces, but I think at smaller ones, it was fantastic. And I think even people who were nervous about joining the union, or people who maybe were a little bit more reluctant to, when they're confronted by some of what their colleagues are enduring, even if their jobs are pretty good, people come around, and they do want to be there, I think, for their colleagues and their friends. So yeah, just complaining in a Slack group and having a private kind of online space where we could talk about these things, for us, it inevitably led to unionization. Like once that thing started, there was no other path. And yeah, it was great.
I love it. Unionize by complaining. So on that actually related note, so I'm going to mash together another couple of questions here. One about media outlets that have been unionized for decades, and the union is sometimes more interested in being friendly with management than actually helping workers with their problems. And then a question from union leader himself, John Schloss, about what criticisms or demands would you have for local, national, and international union leaders? So we can be critical and constructive here about perhaps what we would like to see change about some of the unions that are out there. Anyone? Yeah.
I'll go. That's a really broad question. BAM it already had like 6 or 7 unions in it. You had IATSE, DC 37, multiple locals of each. Unionizing was a very delicate process when we were trying to do just administrative staff, while we have so many other unionized folk around us. It became very like mapping, which is like something everybody does when you start unionizing, became very like intricate. And I think that I don't know a lot of unions that are really friendly with management. I feel like maybe it's just the unions at BAM, but I feel like some of the unions. I mean, let's be frank. Like some unions are dying. Some unions are not as active as it used to be for a multitude of reasons. And those members I really feel for, because there's no outlet for their voice. And I think on the other swing of that is there are unions who are extremely vocal about their union membership. And I'm trying to talk carefully right now. Because BAM had a house that was ununionized. The stagehands were ununionized, while we had two other houses that were unionized. And I feel like there was a lot of tension in between those two groups, and most of that tension only came from one way, only from one union being like, why aren't you all unionized, without knowing like the whole history of why that house wasn't unionized. Sorry, this is like getting so inside baseball, but I think that one thing I would say is that if I could talk directly to other like leaders who are union leaders of large like locals or nationals or internationals or whatever, I would say like there should just be more organizing going on. Like you can see right now, like workers have so much power. There's so many hot shops. There's so many people who just want to like find any mechanism for making their working lives better, making their pay better, and therefore, ironically, that will also make their workplace better. There should just be more organizing going on. And obviously, like, there's so many things that you need to be doing. But I mean, that's what I would do. Like more on the ground organizing, I talked to a lot of groups, even after I left BAM, while we're in the middle of negotiating. I've talked to so many people just like who Instagram me being like, I want to unionize, how do I do it? And I connect them with organizers. And I just think that there's so many things that could be happening that would make that connection more, easier, So I'm sorry, that was a really weird, convoluted answer, but.
Anyone else have some thoughts or criticisms? Marina, yeah.
I think related to that, yes to more organizing. In connection to that, I think recognizing that so many of our industries have related problems. I mean, I feel like we're all going to work for like the same 5 companies and, mega merging companies in the next, 10 years or whatever. So many of our industries have like perpetual rounds of layoffs, like every year, I've been at HuffPost for 7 years, and we've had like basically every year and a half, we've had some devastating round of layoffs. And that's true of so many people, so many companies in news and media, in arts and culture, across so many different sectors. And I feel like it's only going to get worse with, just the way that the economy is, and just, the way that wealth is distributed. I think that's something that can fuel more organizing across a lot of different sectors and across a lot of different unions and from a lot of different union leaders. Is just recognizing that we're all in this together. We all have a lot of shared issues, and hopefully the solutions to those issues are also shared, are also things we can implement across a lot of different sectors.
Yeah, I think already we're seeing that just on this panel, right? The way that people in different spaces have very similar problems. So we are getting close to time, and I'm going to do one more little mashup question here because I think it's related to what we were just talking about. And it's related to the question of cross-sector organizing, because we have somebody who wants to know if we have tips for organizing in gaming, where workers are typically hired on a project-to-project basis, and somebody else who was talking about photojournalism degrading to a gig economy and better freelance contracts. But again, the question of organizing gig media workers. Yeah, and I'm going to let you all jump in on that, and then I have a few thoughts, and then we'll be done. Oh my goodness. These things always go so fast. Anyone want to talk about gig work? Yeah.
I think just kind of jumping off of gig work as well as tying it back into, what kind of change do we need from larger national, international unions? I think, that's where the focus has to be. And I think unions are starting to realize that. But I think it's important to make sure that, one, you're not two-tiering, creating these two-tiered contracts in which essentially you have a small protected class of workers, but like you have all these gig workers, freelancers, everybody else who's, being exploited even more kind of for your benefit, and ensuring that doesn't happen. And, eventually that does lead to longer term strength for unions too, because there's a lot of criticisms amongst people that I came up with in journalism. There was a perception that a lot of the larger unions were not for us. They were there to protect the people who've been there for 20 years. And in fact, they want to push you out. Whether or not that was entirely true, that was certainly the perception. And I can say from experience, at least I've experienced, some of that. So yeah, I think that's like an essential part of what needs to come next. Even if they're not going to be union members, right? Even if our laws haven't caught up, I think it's incredibly important to organize gig workers amongst themselves, and then to, when you're at the bargaining table, fight for their rights, fight for freelancers' rights, even if you're not going to see a penny out of them. I think that's at the heart of what unionism should be about.
I'll chime in. I think that's an extremely hard thing to do, to organize people who are very disparate. But I would say, here's my advice, is to just keep talking to people. We talked to so many different people when we were trying to organize We talked to retired labor lawyers. We talked to colleagues at different workplaces that were unionized, colleagues that were, completely different industries. And it seems insurmountable, but like just like organizing a workplace, like you will reach a point when you have found everybody. Like BAM was like 200, 300 people. We were organizing, we ended up organizing after the pandemic. It's like, barely 100, I think now, but I think like if you just keep talking to people, you might be able to find the answers that you're looking for. Like how do we organize all of these different groups? How do we organize all these different groups of workers? And I mean, they gave us advice that we didn't even think about when we started organizing. Like, this union did this union's like this, etc. Like I would just keep talking to people. Persistence is the key to everything to me. Just keep doing it, and then eventually it'll be done. Yeah.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, yeah, I think talking to people, finding resources like this, I mean, going to panels like this, finding out, from unions, what kind of trainings they have, just try to do as much as you can to learn about the process of unionizing, what it looks like. Talk to people that have done it, talk to people that are interested in it. Just keep at it, as Kaitlyn said, to just learn as much as you can about it, and to be connected to those folks, because one of the really lovely things about this process has been connecting with other shops, has been connecting with other people within other unions, connecting with people who are trying to unionize, connecting with people who are interested in unionizing. It's such a lovely group of people that have this shared common bond of just trying to make their workplace better. And it goes back to the original point about one of the great things about unionizing is that solidarity, that collective strength that comes from not just your colleagues and not just the people within your industry, but throughout the world, there are people that are trying to do this work. And yeah, I would say just seek those people out, seek those organizations out, try to learn as much as you can from those that have gone before you and those that have immediately preceded you, those that are in the same boat as you. Just have those conversations with people.
All right, just like that, we're running out of time. I just wanted to say one last thing, which is, as a freelancer myself, yeah, it can be hard, but there are organizations out there that are working on it. And I put some links in the chat, including the Freelance Solidarity Project, which is part of the National Writers Union, some links on games workers. And I think one of the things that we are finding right now is that people are really coming up with new and interesting ways to organize and communicate, partly out of just the necessity that, like, we are all now isolated workers locked up in our little homes for a lot of the last 2 years. And that means we've had to figure out ways to build bridges in ways that we might not have done before. And so even though the numbers are often depressing, I'm actually really excited to see where things go in the next couple of years. And with that note, I will say thank you to everyone and toss it to Nasser, who's just going to close us out here.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So hey, folks, my name is Nasser Ahmed. I'm a union organizer in Toronto with CWA Canada. I just wanted to jump on here quickly to thank all of our panelists for sharing their valuable insights with us, and Sarah for facilitating this fantastic discussion. You've all given us so much to reflect on as we continue this movement to organize all workers in the digital and cultural sectors. I also wanted to thank my colleagues and co-organizers of today's event, Nicole Cohen and Greg DePuter. The recent book, New Media Unions, has been an incredibly valuable tool for both workers and organizers alike as we look to learn lessons from our past victories and how we can apply them to the fights of the future. You can check out their work at newmediaunions.com. And Nicole and Greg were also kind enough to drop a free downloadable link to their book in the chat, which I encourage all of you to definitely read. And finally, I want to thank all of you who joined us this evening. And I want to finish today with a call to action. You've all heard some incredible stories tonight of how workers have fought back against bad bosses, big corporations, and degrading working conditions. And more importantly, what and how they've been able to win in the face of those challenges. We all feel the very real momentum in the labor movement at this moment in history. And if you want to continue this momentum, if you want to be a part of that movement, I ask you to please get in touch with me and my colleagues at CWA Canada. You can do so if you want to get organized by visiting digitalmediaunion.ca. And of course, if you're based in the US, you can reach out to our sisters and brothers at the News Guild. So let's keep this momentum alive in 2022, because after all, we've got a world to win. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening.